I give you Father Sam Argenziano, who will talk about the roles of Pope Pius XII and Angelo Roncalli, the future Pope John XXIII. Father Sam?
Thank you very much. The Italians clap back. I don't know why we do that, but we clap back. Thank you, Stan, for the very kind words. Hope you had a good time. I'm going home. No, okay. This is always a difficult time for me in expressing and talking about the Shoah, because it is something that it weighs always heavy on my heart. And I'll have to give you a little history why. So, first of all, I remember with great memory my parents, who were the first teachers of respect and dialogue. So let's say our house was here, Mr. and Mrs. Crabtree were over here, Presbyterian. They don't drink too much, so we didn't party too much with them. And then Mr. and Mrs. Edelman, and they were Ashkenazi Jews from Poland on this side. They were much older than my mother and father, but I always loved being with them. In fact, they used to warm my heart, because, the old-fashioned house, the bedrooms were on the second floor. My bedroom looked down into their kitchen. Mr. Edelman drove a soda truck. That's what he did for a living, delivering soda to the various stores in that neighborhood. Come home at night, she would light the candles, kippah on, and I'd be like this looking. And it was like this mystical expression of faith. I mean, I'm 8, 9 years old. I can say that now. I couldn't put those words to it then, right? But there was just something wonderful in their prayerful expression. Then, of course, in the fall, she'd call me over. Sammy, come here. Yes, Mrs. Allen? The apples on the ground. Take them to your mother. She'll make you an apple pie. Me, brat. How about the apples in the tree? They're for God. I don't know what that meant. But Mrs. Edelman said, I'm going to take that. That's something very, very holy, right? And so this stuff sort of stayed in the back. And what happened next, though, about a year or so later, they put a documentary together called Remember Us. Because Eisenhower said to the soldiers, people aren't going to remember this. Aren't not going to remember. They're not going to believe this. And so they filmed. They took pictures. And they put it together, and it's called Remember Us. I remember this, like 9, 10 years old. And I'm sitting there looking at these images of the Walking Dead suffering. And I can remember saying to myself, why would anybody want to do this to Mr. and Mrs. Edelman? Now, I'm born in 1947, so the war's over 2 years, right? But now I have a connection that's a distant connection to people who were murdered. This stayed with my heart and in my brain. So then as I grew up in university and theology and then into pastoral life, jumped on quickly and invited to be with Sandy Hyman and Interfaith Roundtable, Better Relations Between Christians and Jews. That was the first time at the old center on Harvard's, Hargrave, that's the name of the place, Hargrave. I'm 70, you gotta excuse me, okay. So this is where all of the past memories begin to take shape in religious, humanistic, theological study and conversion, right? Conversion. I find that part of my ministry was always to end the anti-stuff, right? And now in one of my favorite musicals, and Belle said she was dressed up like a nun in this musical, The Sound of Music, right? There's a song, I think all of you know that wonderful Julie Andrews musical. And there's a song and it says, let's start from the very beginning. It's about learning how to read music and sing. But I always like to start from the beginning because you never know what people don't know or have been told. And I remember preaching here upstairs and, talking about how Jesus was a Jew and Judaism is our mother faith. A very intelligent woman, educated woman came to me later and said, Jesus was a Jew? I should drop dead in front of you if I'm lying. Right? And so that always reminded me, you know what, when I'm with an audience of people who are Christian and may not know, I always have to get that out, right? I always like to joke around about stuff too. I always like to say, Christianity, it's a 2,000-year-old Jewish cult, right? We call it the New Testament. When you study them, they're Jewish books, right? And they have to be studied in that eye, right? So when we look at the early church, ecclesia, people gathered together, right? What do we have? We're the same family. So just think we're in, Nazareth, Capernaum, someplace, and this is our synagogue, and 3 rows over there think Jesus is the Messiah, a couple of rows back there, and they're having all this discussion, right? And it causes tension. In Luke's gospel, right? It's even, now remember, these books are written just like in the First Testament, much after all the events. And so Luke has Jesus saying, you think I'm here to bring peace? There's going to be father against son, son against mother, and he even says daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. That I can understand. But goes on and on and on and on in the book, right? And why? Because the community is in a problematic situation. People are arguing about this. And I think where the pimple begins, the pimple, sometimes in the summertime you get a pimple back here. It's not going to kill you, but it's uncomfortable. The pimple begins after the temple is destroyed. We get to be synagogal in worship, right? And I think it's around the year 90 that those in synagogue who believe that Jesus is the Messiah are excommunicated. That's the start. Okay, that's the start. It takes a long time for this to grow. People are still working there. I know I would have been, as the people would say, myself personally, I would have been a Judaizer. Judaizers were people who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but there's no feast days yet. So I would have been going back, like you read in the Acts of the Apostles. That's Luke's second book. James and John are going up to the temple to pray. You think they're going to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York? Right? There are Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah. They're not giving up on prayer in the temple. They're not giving up on meetings in the synagogue. Right? They are living out their faith. The only thing that's different in that 25, 30 years is that they would get together on Sunday to remember the resurrection and share a type of communion meal together. That was the only difference. In the meantime, we're still going to the temple and we're still going to the synagogue. Things begin to change, especially when Paul, right, whose name was Saul, who's both a Jew, a Pharisee, and a Roman, gets on he printed every thought he ever had. Sometimes when I read him, I go, you should have got hit over the head, right? Just every thought. And then, of course, we know that he had secretaries who sometimes were filling in the blanks. So as Paul begins to preach and go, what happens is the family then begins to grow. Right? One of the things we see as the Gentile people start coming into our faith, then they're bringing in, people are maturing. Right? People are maturing in Rome and in Greece. They're leaving the idea of many gods. They want to belong to a monotheistic religion. I always joke with Rabbi Rose and Alan and Rabbi Green and say, listen, I'm a 40-year-old man. I want to join a monotheistic group. What happens? How do I get there? No, you're studying, so on. Well, how do I get indoctrinated? Well, on this side, you just have a mikveh and it's over. That side, you got to be circumcised and you can't eat this and you can't eat that. What? Okay, let's check over here. All right? I think there's a little play in that. There's a little play in that. Right? And so then the Gentile world begins to enter and enter and enter, right? And then we get to the 4th century, and what happens to this group? Right? Constantine, right? He sees what? There's a lot of Christians in his empire, right? So he's not stupid. He wants to keep this under control, right? So he stops, right? He stops the persecutions for a while. They still came. And then Christianity more or less becomes like the official religion of the time. And then we start taking off. I think what happens, we have people like John Chrysostom, Augustine, as centuries move on, Luther, who promote anti-Semitism very strongly. Luther in the beginning wasn't too bad. Then I think it was Otto who becomes the king of the Holy Roman Empire. And this guy is a rampant anti-Semite. And so Luther wants him on his side, and Luther changes his tune. And some of the things he said, Jews should be burnt, their ashes mixed with pig shit. You hear this and you can't believe that someone of faith is saying this. So of course what happens, this begins to fester, right, in this. Now, does everybody think like this? No, of course not. But it begins to fester. And I'm not going to spend all night on the lies that, I always think that the lie that Jews put poison in the drinking water to bring the plague. But what were they supposed to drink? Yeah. And people believe this, these kind of lies. And this stuff hangs around. Aquinas in the 13th century, he is a great theological mind, but he was of the opinion, right, that it wasn't because they were educated, but because Jews implicitly, explicitly did not want to move into faith. Now you get that kind of theological thought moving, well, that creates what? Anger. You don't want to be with us. You're not accepting the truth. You're not accepting what God wants you to accept. And that begins to foster itself, right? We get this kind of thought. So, I always say that the Holocaust wasn't the product of Nazi Germany, 1933, right? This is 1,500 years of persecution. It's only in the last 50 years that we, begin to just mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. In the last 50 or some odd years, right? Again, is it the whole church? No. And so it depends, of course, who's sitting on the throne of Peter. And I'm not going to give you every pope, but for instance, by the time we get, there were some. And remember, the papacy as a institution, more or less the way we know it, it's like the structure is about 1,500 years old. And we know there was a time, especially like Alexander VI in the 15th century, their authority in the world, like he split the world in half, told the Portuguese to go, you go east, told the Spanish, you go west, okay? That's the type of influence and power that office had in the world. When did that really change? Italy becomes Italy 1860? 1860. 1864? All right, give or take a couple of years, right? So remember, what does the church have? We call them the papal states. The way Canada has 10 provinces, Italy has 20 regions. And the papal states had 2 of those regions, right? Lazio and Marche, right? So now what happens, Garibaldi wants to unite the whole country. Some people still think that's a mistake. I don't know. But, especially the northern Italians. Anybody here from, no? Okay. So anyway, Garibaldi unites the whole country and takes, it wasn't a discussion with the Pius the Ninth, right, in the 19th century, that time around 1860. It wasn't like, let's sit down and how much do you think these papal states are worth? And we'll pay you. No, these were like this. Okay. And so what happens as the papal states then are taken away, they left this little area called Vatican City, and it becomes the struggle, with the church and the new Italian government. And so they don't work things out till about 1927. But to understand machinations, to understand how the Vatican works, okay, you have to really study also modern Italian history. Right? You have to work. So what happens is, in order for the church to operate in freedom, this Vatican state is formed, makes a concordat with the Mussolini in 1927. Then the Vatican begins to also make what we call agreements or concordats with other countries in the world. Right? So when you make an agreement, you're saying, okay, we're going to recognize your country as a legitimate country. You recognize the Vatican as an independent state. Okay? And these concordats are still, in fact, in the world today, right, you have the papal representative in every country. So if the country doesn't recognize the Vatican City as an independent city-state, then it's the man representing the Pope in that country is an apostolic nuncio. And then if the country like Canada recognizes, the Vatican as an independent city-state, and then he's part of the diplomatic corps of the church working in Canada. During the time of Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, Pius XI, so this is in the 20s and leading into the 30s, is having a very difficult time with fascism and Nazism. He wrote an encyclical letter, not to the whole world, but he writes it to Germany, basically, to the bishops in Germany, and it was called With Burning Concern. And he was against Hitler, and he was against anti-Semitism. So he's there, Pius XI, right, sending this, to the people of Germany. Pius XII, now we're going to move into him. Let me have a drink of water. This gets a little tough. So there's two books I brought down from my library. One is called Crown of Glory, written in the 50s, two Irishmen, right? And Alden Hatch and Seamus Walsh. When you look through here, there's no mention of Holocaust or Jews. When you look through this book, it's, Adolf Hitler is mentioned, okay? When you look at this book, Hitler's Pope, and I'll quote something from here just to clarify the title, okay? So what are we looking at in Pius XII? A person born into a noble Roman family. His family would have been lawyers, and they worked also for Vatican City. So he grew up in the milieu of the institutional church. He's a Roman, and the family's connectedness is there. If you're going to look at Pius, whose name was Eugenio Pacelli, right? He's very much formed in the institution. He's very much formed in the institution. All of us have run into people like that in our lives, either religiously or civilly. It's the institution. It's the institution. Everything is sacrificed to the institution. And Pacelli, on the Pius XI, is one of those nuncios representing the Vatican in Bavaria. right? And of course had to learn German. They say that when he did become Pope in 1938, more German was spoken in the Vatican than Italian. And he just loved that. He loved the language, but he loved the orderliness that you find in German society. But Pius was sent there to do what? To strengthen the position of the church in Germany. Right? To strengthen the position of the church in Germany. So let me read to you what the author of this book is John Cornwell. Now this is a reworking of the preface. This is the second printing. Since the publication of this book almost a decade ago, many a fervent report has been mounted against the so-called myth of Hitler's Pope, based on the mistaken assumption that I have characterized Eugenio Pacelli as a Nazi sympathizer and a rabid anti-Semite. My portrait of Pacelli carries neither of these imputations, although those who do not get beyond the book's cover might think otherwise. I believe now, as I did when this book was first published, that Eugenio Pacelli was Hitler's Pope not because he favored Hitler, which he did not, nor because he was an anti-Semitic, which he was not, although he displayed an anti-Jewishness typical among Catholics of his time, but because he was an ideal church leader for Hitler's purposes. I am not inclined to alter this view despite the many citations of Pacelli's alleged deeds of mercy towards Jews and others, or his private criticism of Hitler, or his cautious, even handed down reproaches against both the Axis and the Allied powers during the Second World War. The crucial narrative center of gravity of my account of Pacelli's life is not the wartime period, but the early 1930s when, as Cardinal Secretary of State with wide executive authority for the conduct of Vatican-German relations, he entered into a series of negotiations with Hitler, culminating in Reich Concordat, an international treaty between the Vatican and the German state. Hitler had urgent reasons for doing a deal with the Vatican. Fearful of new Catholic Kulturkampf, the conflict between Catholicism and the state under Bismarck in the late 19th century, Hitler sought to abolish Germans' Catholic political and social associations, more or less any form of Catholic communal activity, from newspapers to sewing circles to Boy Scout groups. In exchange, he offered certain benefits and privileges to the Catholic Church. Pacelli agreed. In fact, sometimes I had to put the book down. There was a Catholic political group, like we have NDP, right? There was a Catholic, political group, and Pacelli made it close down in order to get the government backing in this Concordat. Although we know as time evolves, Hitler just disregards all of the Concordat. What does the world say about Pius XII? What is the problem? It's that he didn't say enough. He did send a letter in German to the bishops in Germany decrying Nazism, anti-Semitism. Yes, he did. But he wasn't on the bandstand. He should have been saying more. He should have been out there, right? Just making public decry. Yes. And as he said, there was a certain amount of, there was not a certain amount, there was anti-Semitism. People are always tainted and painted by what their families say.
Hearsay.
Right? Hearsay.
Yeah, hearsay.
I mean, I grew up in myself. Right? I grew up, I could tell you the story about myself, but I'm not going to use the word, but I'm going to use the letter. I'm like 4 years old, and we lived in an apartment across the street from a garage that held garbage trucks for the neighborhood, right? New York City garbage trucks. And I'd leave the apartment from the third floor, go down, go across the street. There's a guy there, probably ready to retire. That's his job, just keeping people out of the garage. And he'd twirl me around and twirl me around and twirl me around. Then he's getting tired. And so this one particular day, two black children or adults, or not adults, like teenagers, are walking up the street and goes, oh, let them twirl you around a little bit. And I said, they can't touch me, they're N. I'm 4 years old. So maybe people around, family, oh, we have to move out of the neighborhood because certain people are moving in. We're not born with prejudice, we're taught prejudice. So when people are repeating the lies and repeating, those anti-Semitic slogans, of course, that's in it, right? Remember, Pacelli is living in free Rome. At that time, the Jewish people are in a ghetto, a wall, and depending on who was the Pope. Sometimes the walls were taken down, sometimes the walls were put up. There was other times, before people could go to synagogue to pray, to go for services, they all had to be led to a particular church where there was a painting of the crucifixion, and the pastor of that church had to give them a homily. That's what you did. And then after that, they were allowed to go into synagogue. So Pacelli would have grown up with that type of, and in this book also, it's quoted, people were saying what was beginning to happen in 1933 and 1934. And it's quoted, let the Jews take care of themselves. This ain't easy for me to say this here, because we all like where we belong and what our families are to be spotless. But you grow up, right? So Pacelli did not do enough. He did not say enough. Would it have stopped the machine? I don't know. But at least the world would have known. I go to movies a lot, right? I go every week. Movies are the mirror of society as far as I'm concerned. Some are popcorn movies, they're just different than Star Wars. That's enjoyable stuff. But remember the movie The Ship of Fools? Yes. Now, it really plays on the different personalities on that ship. But it reminds us that the world was guilty of this. They try to get off, right? Why the Cubans didn't recognize, because that's where they were supposed to go. The Cuban government gave permission for the Jewish people to go to Cuba. They refused, Canada refused, the United States refused. Back to England, they go to England, some people are let off, everybody else went to death. So, he should have. At least he would have made the world aware. And the world does listen. Even if the world doesn't listen, let's say, to every religious thought that the Pope speaks, the world does listen. For instance, John the 23rd, the next. He's not born in any aristocratic family. He is not born in a city. He was born outside of a northern Italian city called Bergamo, which is maybe a 40-minute run by car, northeast of Milano. But he's not born in the city. He's born in a little sotto il monte, under the mountain. It's a farming town. And that's where he was born. And that's where he was formed, right? And that was his life. And Angelo Roncalli was very intelligent, right? And he also, after seminary, worked with the bishop in Bergamo, was sent on for further studies, was a teacher, was ordained to the priesthood, and also was put in the diplomatic corps. But Angelo Roncalli, although representing the institution, put people first. Pius sent him to Bulgaria to be the papal representative there. And one of the stuff, that area is very, very orthodox. It's not a haven of Roman Catholicism. So what's the first thing he starts doing? And remember, we live now in the interfaith ecumenical world. In the 19, what is he there? 1930s, 1940s, the walls are up. And he begins knocking on the doors, right? Just going out, reaching out, and knocking down the walls in order for there to be a better understanding between these different groups. So Angelo Roncalli had a much different flavor for the world. In fact, he has to be the most loved Pope in our modern times. Because the Italian government stole those papal states, Pius IX, Pius X, Pius XI, right? Even in Pius XII. They didn't leave the Vatican as a protest. John the 23rd was the first one. It's like almost 100 years. He leaves the property and he begins to go, he goes to a big prison, the Regina Coeli on the Tiber. He goes, visits prisoners, he goes to hospitals, he's reaching out to people. He has Khrushchev's son-in-law and daughter visit, you could imagine. To be a communist in Italy during that time, you were excommunicated from the church. He had the leader of the Anglican Church, right, the Archbishop, come. And it said that Roncalli said to him, all the people that started this fuss 400 years ago, they're dead. He was the one to begin. Roncalli had Jewish theologians come. One that I love, I keep on reading about. I read his works, and because I was so in Abraham Joshua Heschel. Everybody knows him, right? If you don't, you've been living under a rock. But he was like one of those special theologians that went, and it's from these theologians, rabbis, that the church formed, right? And a document called In Our Time. John the 23rd, he's the one who calls for the Catholic Church. We call it an ecumenical council. All the bishops from the world. Now, some people didn't like this. And when did he do this? He's elected in 1958. This is like 1959, 1960. He's celebrating the Eucharist at the hall outside the walls, Basilica. They get into this vesting room, the sacristy, and he goes, we gotta let some good fresh air into this church. We need a council. Well, let me tell you, there's some people where you sit going like this. Right? One, Cardinal Tabiani, this man was old school. He did his best to fight at this and try to sabotage. Remember, this is 1960. Letters, no email, none of this. Letters are being sent out to the bishops around the world, right? We're having an ecumenical council. What do you think we should discuss? The machinery of the Vatican wanted to be like, we'll tell them what to talk about. We'll tell them yes or no. And it didn't happen. It did not happen. Roncalli worked hard with a great charity, even towards those who were against him, but he worked hard to get this council off. And so it opens up in 1963. And they met in session from 63 to 65. And they talked about everything under the sun, right? Everything, right? Most people in the pew, what affected them? We moved from praying in Latin with the altar against the wall. Everybody could pray in your own language, right? There were still some people that were still mad about that. Why? God only knows Latin? I thought God only knew Hebrew. So it was a tough time, right? But one of the things that comes out, right? One of the things that comes out is how we understand. Respect, this is, the document is called, in Latin, aspetta. Gaudium et Spes, hope and joy, right? This is how we understand ourselves, the world. I want you just to listen to this, one little piece. Coming to topics which are practical and of some urgency, The council lays stress on respect for the human person. Everybody should look upon his or her neighbor, without any exception, as another self, bearing in mind especially their neighbor's life and the means needed for a dignified way of life, lest they follow the example of the rich man who ignored Lazarus, who was poor. So this comes out of the church. This was promulgated October, 28th October 1965. The respect for each person. And if anyone ever dares to contradict, this is the Vatican Council too, this is the teachings of the church today. Not the 19th century, the church, this was the 20th century. It just, budget. And because of people like Heschel and other great theologians in Jewish life, and also from that council was a document called Nostre Aetate, in our time, right? Indeed, the church reproves every form of persecution against whomever it may be directed, remembering then its common heritage, the church's common heritage with the Jews, and moved not by any political consideration, but solely by the religious motivation of Christian charity, it deplores all hatreds, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism leveled at any time or from any source against the Jews. So that's part of our religious and social teaching. And this comes from John the 23rd. He dies and Paul VI is elected, right? Paul VI had to finish the council because John started it, but he died before, and Paul pushed for the council, of course, to be finished. And during his time, right, that all of the documents in the Vatican Council are promoted. Right? Paul was a great, and he took the name Paul because he wanted to be like a missionary pope. He wanted to visit people. And of course, one of the places he does, a visit is Israel. First pope to go there, right? And so Paul VI lives out, what John the 23rd had started, right? And then after Paul VI,
What year is this?
Paul VI would have been the Pope from 1963 to 1978.
And the Pope before him, John was...
John the 23rd was 1958 to 1963.
And his name was Angelo.
And his name was Angelo. That was his baptismal name, Angelo Roncalli. And what happens in these documents that John initiates but doesn't get finished till Paul VI is right? A whole new looking at who we are. You look through all these different documents, and there's always the respect, a new respect for everyone's religion. The documents call us to respect how other people live, how other people believe, how other people search for God. That wasn't the way it always was. We're right, you're wrong, tough. No more. And that's why it's good, we have to continuously educate people on this, because we know that lies and stereotypes can always be advanced. We have to stop. What happens even in the Muslim world? What do some of the people who are xenophobic are afraid of? Jihad. Jihad is a spiritual movement. It's a war within myself to eradicate everything that stops me from being God-like. That's the pure essence of that word. Doesn't mean make war with others. But people who are not religious, who are terrorists in nature, well, they will use a term and they will twist it around. And then it puts the fear of the foreigner in people who don't know. That's why, as my 8th grade teacher, Sister Mary Charles, said to me, Argenziano, there's no substitute for brains. Right? We have to educate, search, and research. Right? Because we know when people write history, there's a lot of revisionism that goes on. People who were writing history after the end of the Civil War in the United States, oh, it wasn't about slavery. Are you serious? Right? So we have to continuously keep our minds alert and well-read. And that's the part that I loved about what happens in this council, is that our lives, our minds are opened, you know, to know that what? There's many paths to God. And Rabbi Green and I talked one time, when we get overly dogmatic, we get in trouble. We get very much, and we look, right? Like in Judaism, right? There's the different groups, conservative, reform, I actually went to Jerusalem to a part of the city, ultra-Orthodox. So I'm with Rabbi Neil, and we're going down the street, and he's wondering why the stores aren't open yet, right? Then he starts, it's the beginning of a new month, there's special prayers and blessings. See, again, that touches my heart. It'd be nice to live in a society like that. I don't got to go to work till about 10 after 10 because I'm in the synagogue. I think that's great. I'd love that, right? North Americans, oh my God, God forbid, right? You're in church an hour and a half, right? I remember when Heschel went to Cincinnati, and so he moved in his life from Hasidim to the conservative movement. But he's put a bunch of reconstructionists, and they didn't even want him to wear the kippah on his head, right? Oh, you wear that, we're going to kick you out. So every group has its, right, within ways of interpreting, look at Christianity, right? Stan and I could start a church tomorrow, Sam and Stan's church. Oh, we like those two, let's do it, all right? Right? We won't charge you too much, right? And within 15 years, we got our own jet. Okay. But that's the nature of the beast, right? That's the nature of the beast, right? So every group has, within itself, Christianity itself, right? All the different groups have the interpretation, right? Judaism, the same thing. Muslim, the same thing, right? Different ways of looking. But I can only speak for my own group. We always must. There was a council in the 14th century that said the church must always be reforming itself. And too bad we didn't listen. That was the 14th century. The church must always be reforming itself. This is what the Council, the Vatican Council, calls us to. It calls us to what? To look, to relook, and to do what? To reform ourselves continuously. To look at the world not with suspicion. To look at other religious groups and other faith not with suspicion, but with charity and dialogue and love and understanding. So, for 1,500 years, we did not do that with our mother faith. And it took 1,500 years to stop it. And it only is in the last little section of our life that we're here. So, I could walk around and bemoan this, or I could rejoice. I have both. I will always have in my heart that angst about it, that hurt about it, but I also rejoice that we're in a new era, that we could do this. 1952, we would have been doing this. Maybe a few scholars and intellects together, but it would not have been here. It would not have been at Sher Zedek last night, or the museum on Sunday afternoon. Right? So, thank God we're able to do what we do. And we have to continue. I call this our spiritual authority. No matter where we lie in any one religious camp or non-religious camp, be it in religion or in humanity, there is the authority of good. And we need to do that. We continuously have to be in the authority of bringing life, the respect of every person. As the Council Father said, to see the other as ourself. And that's the beautiful thing too, that all of us share in this one, the golden rule. Every religion that has a scripture, a sacred writing, we all have do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. Every one of them, from Christianity to Zoroastrianism, we all have that. So imagine if everybody really lived this, cops would have to get another job. There'd be no more military, right? But unfortunately, the world is the world. And so, but we work at it. And I think that's the most important thing to do, is to work at this, right? To remold, to reshape the world that we live in. In the Jewish, in our mother faith, we have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur every year. So we took that with us too. We call it Lent. But you guys fast one day, we got 40. Somebody made a mistake. And so what do? Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we look at how to live a better life. Get rid of the mistakes of last year and do better this year. Same thing with Lent. Lent is a time for us, it starts this year, February 14th, right? And we move for 40 days. And it's really a time of reform, right? For those who are going to be initiated to faith, right? They're the last kick at the cat of getting ready to be baptized, the adults. For us who've been, cradle Catholics, it's time for us to look, how did I live my baptismal calling last year? Sorry, God, right? And so there is this sense of reformation in all of our faith journeys, because we know we're human and we get pulled away from, right? We get pulled away. So when we enter into this time of reformation of our own self, our own jihad, our own experience of wanting to do better, most of it is about my relationship with each other. There was in the Christian scriptures, there's a letter of John that's in John's letter it says, how can you say you love God whom you don't see if you don't love your neighbor who you do see? And the neighbor doesn't say Jewish, Gentile, your neighbor. Your neighbor. And that's bringing us to the fullness of life. So we see the church, the ecclesia, the people gathered together on this journey. And St. John Paul II, in his visit to Israel, reminded us that we are brothers and sisters and that we are all children of Abraham. He's the spiritual father. So, and the more we bring this back, the more we're going to have our own conversions that show for doesn't happen again to not a soul on this planet. And it really has to be as simple also, and sometimes difficult in our speech. We have to move away from innuendo and sometimes joke, but sometimes forced us in a way, forced us in a way, an anti-whatever. And we have to be very careful of that all the time. Today we call it political correctness, but I think it's beyond politics. For me, it has to be a religious, a spiritual fervor, right? That we don't fall back into what was going on in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries. Right? That I say something to you and then it's held on and you say it and someone else says it. No. This has to be a reformation of self so that we continue to be what? A people of peacefulness, a people of understanding, people of forgiveness. And that's the hard part. Francis, who is Pope now, is very much, if I believed in reincarnation, it's John the 23rd come back to life. The Pope that is now in ministry now, right? He hasn't changed a thing. Like changing laws about, how does he approach? What did the news calls it the Francis effect. Why? Because he's reaching out to people with mercy and love. He says the church should be like a hospital in the middle of a war, soothing people's wounds. Everybody, not just Roman Catholics. Right? He says the church must be like a hospital in the middle of a war, an army hospital. Right? Someone once asked him on the plane about people, homosexual, and he says, who am I to judge? People, like in our tradition, if you're married and divorced and you haven't got an annulment, you can't remarry in the church, right? He put the word out, you get these annulments done quick and don't charge for them. Right? He himself went to the Holy Land and also went to the site of the Shoah and spent time in prayer there. He himself has also asked forgiveness. So the papacy of our modern world is definitely not the papacy of pre-Italy. The papacy of today sees itself as a minister of reconciliation and peace. And so we pray that this remained. And I'm hoping, Francis he turned 80 in December. I'm hoping God grants him at least another 10 years, because he's doing so marvelously well in the role. So we have John the 23rd, one fellow I missed because he was only for a month. John Paul I. They called him the smiling Pope. Right? After I couldn't believe it. After a month, he dies. He had a bad heart. They probably were putting all the BS that's going on in the world of the church. It probably knocked him right out. Okay, take me home. Okay, take me home. And that's when John Paul II is elected. I'll never forget this. I mean, this is the first non-Italian in trillion years, 600 years or something. So I was at St. Edward the Confessor parish. I was a deacon at the time. Walk in the house, the phone is ringing, I pick up the phone. Get upstairs, watch the television, we have a new Pope. Oh, okay. So I go upstairs, boom, cameras in St. Peter's Square. It's kind of dusky. And then he comes out there. I'm looking, looks like a Northern Italian, all right. Caro Voitiva. What is Caro Voitiva? That's not even Friulan. What is this? Polacco, mamma mia, right? Right? So of course then all the jokes would start about, no more Italians, and now we're gonna not eat pasta anymore, we're gonna eat pierogi, sir. But God always has a way. Yeah. Now, the world looked at him, and to show you, the world looked at him, right, as like one of the most wonderful popes. In fact, when he died, millions went to Rome. The Petrini, those who run like the basilica, they thought, they'd have to shut the basilica down like he died, his body was in there. Millions. They couldn't shut the doors. they were open at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, right? Because he went around the world and he himself was pushing, right, the documents out of Vatican II. The respect of the human person, the right for everyone to practice their religion, right? For those of us in the church, though, like, you know, in the structure, he was a centrist. Like, he was like a Polish prince. Pope's going to rule everything, and you will, you know. In the early church, George, these are my Greek, oh yeah. The early church structure was very much like the Greek Orthodox Church. Like I said, the papacy begins to take on this form under Leo the First, about 1,500 years ago. But before that, it was bishops together discussing, right? But John Paul, he liked the tightness, if you want to say, of the. But that, what are you going to call it? Machinery of the church didn't stop him from pushing the teachings of the Vatican Council. Thank God for that. So, in wrapping up tonight, we see what? A journey of a people of God, and not all the people acted the same way, right? There were pockets, and we know during this time of persecution of our brothers and sisters in Judaism, we know there were pockets of people who reached out. Not enough, right? The movie, the book, Diary of Anne Frank, holding her. In Italy, I didn't write the book, so I'm not pushing it. This is a book, it's written by a woman called Elizabeth Bettina, and it's called It Happened in Italy. Her grandparents came from a little town called Campania. And Campania is in a region called Campania. And one day, she hears the grandma and grandpa talking about the camp. What are you talking about, the camp? And so when the Italian government was allied with the Axis power, right, they switched in 1943, September 1943. Until that time, Jews in Italy had to be put in camps also. Now, I don't know how all the camps were, but I know about this camp because she wrote the book. So they had to build the camp, but people did not wear prisoners' uniforms. In fact, there's a picture in here you see the rabbi, the bishop, the police, everybody's together taking a photo. People were eating, synagogue was there, children went to school, marriages were held. Unfortunately, people had to be encamped. And this, I don't know what the rest of the camps were like in Italy, but in this particular camp. And the Italians would use a phrase, it sounds strange, but they would say, ma sono cristiani come noi. They're Christians like us. They use the word Christian to mean human being. So the people in this town respected, held up, treated well, even though they had to be incarcerated. And when the Italian government switched to the Allies in 43, the Germans wanted to come in and take the Jews out of Italy and bring them and kill them. The people in this town opened up the gate and took them into the woods. They hid them in the woods, right, and fed people and took care of them. And so Elizabeth heard the story, and what did she do? She started trying to find as many people as she could who were in that camp. And there were people in New York, smart people who retired to Florida, right? And she rounded up as many people as she could, and they made a trip back to Campania. So they went there again, and the people met each other, embraced each other, and even had a meeting with John Paul II. So as much as the evil was spread, there were pockets of people who did good. Right? There were pockets of people who did good. Right? So we hold on to that, and we cherish that, and we have to be the pockets of people. So for me, then, we take 3 days of what we have in remembrance here, and we have to address it also to our national picture. So, as Paul VI, he was the first pope to address the United Nations, October the 4th, 1965, says, no more war, never again war. Right? In our hearts, we have to reflect no more hatred, no more discrimination, no more standing for anything that destroys the other, who really is a reflection of ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Sam. You want to start a church?
Sure.
Right across from Bar Italia. How's that? Now it's